Man was born free, and he is everywhere in chains. Jean-Jacques Rousseau begins his book, The Social Contract, with a declaration of both the natural state of humanity and its current position. What he means in these words is that we as humans were only truly free in our earliest form, a state he would define as the noble savage, a natural manifestation of humanity that we slowly moved away from as we came closer together, at first as tribes, then as nations, through which we have deliberately allowed ourselves to be enslaved by those who stole power for their own, and that the state, as it stood in his time, did not grant freedom, but rather took it from us, so that some may prosper, while many suffered. In this way, he aimed to envision a form of state that, while it would not allow us to be totally free, as we were in our natural form, would grant freedom through the application of the general will of the members of that state, you and I. Before the advent of the Romanticism movement, spurred on by writers and philosophers like Rousseau, humanity was considered inherently vile and selfish, and thus must be governed by the noble and strong. Rousseau rebelled against this notion, as there was no inherent right when it came to strength, and that it was rather an explanation provided by those in power to validate their existence. In his earlier work, The Discourse on the Origins of Inequality Among Men, he would explain this transition from the noble savage to that of humanity's current form. In regards to the noble savage, he would say that humanity had two core traits, amour de soi and pitié, or an instinct for self-preservation and empathy for one's own species. In this form of being, the noble savage cared not for property, possessions, or control over one another, but rather lived a simple existence where each person lived for themselves while holding compassion for one another, stating that they had no moral relations with or determinate obligations to one another. To Rousseau, this was our state of nature, and our straying from this form over time is what has created our bonds of enslavement to kings and governments, to those who rule not for our sake, but for their own. To this end, he states, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone once you forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" What Rousseau is saying in this statement is that before the advent of civil society, there was more land and resources than we could conceivably use, and everyone lived for themselves in a nomadic lifestyle. Slowly, though, we began claiming private property, cultivating the land, and dividing labor among ourselves, which created interdependence. This interdependence, as he defined, was one where no single person had all of the skills that were required to survive, as it had been in the past. Instead, each person relied on one another to do part of the work, or charge others to work it for us. Within this transition, the concepts of wealth and status were born. At first, there was little difference in this wealth and status, but as we refined our civilizations, these gaps became greater and social hierarchies were formed. Through this progression, we valued less how we saw ourselves and more how others saw us. This is where the values of empathy were replaced with envy. In his mind, envy was the root of humanity's failings. After these social hierarchies became what we know them now to be, it was prudent to those with power and wealth to make laws that maintain their status, rather than provide the best life it could for its citizens. To this, Rousseau said in his book, The Social Contract, "In truth, laws are always useful to those with possessions, and harmful to those who have nothing, from which it follows that the social state is advantageous to men only when all possess something and none has too much." With this realization, he set out to form a political philosophy which could govern humanity through individual states, in a way closest to a desirable outcome for all, not a few, as he knew we could never truly return back to our state of nature, as society had progressed beyond the point of no return. This is when he would go on to write his most important work, The Social Contract. In The Social Contract, Rousseau envisioned a system where we as the people would define the general will of the citizens within the state, which in turn would dictate the laws that would govern us. This governance through the application of the general will was, in his mind, the only chance we had for liberty. The collection of citizens within the state that Rousseau lays out is called the sovereign, and each person within the sovereign makes up the whole, and that the will of the whole is referred to as the general will. Through leveraging the general will, laws will be created that benefit the sovereign and state. This does mean that all within the state must abide by the general will, which is codified in the Constitution and the laws of the state. It may seem as though you are bending your knee to others and rejecting freedom by creating such laws, but he saw it different, as we are the ones defining the rules we live by, in turn becoming masters of ourselves, not others. In this regard, he says, "Apart from the foregoing to the gains of the civil state might be added moral liberty, which alone makes man truly master of himself. For the impulsion of mere appetite is slavery, while obedience to the laws you have set yourself is liberty." This notion can come off as contradictory. How can we be free through obedience to laws? But I think of it like this. Laws in their purest form are a contract we hold with one another to codify the morality of the state. If these laws then are decided upon through the application of the general will of the people, then those laws are aligned with our own view of how the state should function. So then, if we have agreed upon the terms that we ourselves have set forth, then we're merely stating how we intend to interact with the state in a way that benefits us and the people we share the state with, the sovereign. Freedom as it was in the time of the noble savage can no longer be obtained, while freedom through a cooperation based on the needs of the sovereign and not some foreign entity is the closest we can come to such freedom. These laws would be applied to all within the state, and none above them. They would not be created to protect the wealthy and powerful, but rather to allow each person within the state to have what they need, and none in excess. I find the best example of this notion is his thoughts on property, and how it should be divided. For this, he set 3 rules. First, that this land not yet be occupied by anyone. Secondly, that you occupy only so much of it as you need to subsist. In the third place, that you take possession of it not through some vain ceremony, but by labor and cultivation. Through this declaration, he makes it known that we cannot have more than we can feasibly work ourselves, which is a rejection of the idea of holding on to great estates, which are worked upon by laborers, or worse yet, slaves. If this is upheld, then everyone will have what they need, and no one person can take beyond their means. Rousseau talks a lot about how we should strive for a state where everyone is equally free. He does not mean that each person in the state will be exactly equal in wealth and power, but rather equal in rights and means. To this end, he makes the statement which I think is important to bring up. As for equality, this word must not be taken to mean that degrees of power and wealth should be absolutely identical, but that in the case of power it should stop short of violence, and never be exerted other than in keeping with rank and laws. And in the case of wealth, no citizen should be so opulent as to be able to buy another, and none so poor as to be forced to sell themselves. When crafting these laws, the general will must always be upheld as an obligation to one another, and no law may name an individual or group. These laws must only apply to the sovereign as a whole. They must work for one another just as they work for oneself. These laws then would be an obligation we hold to one another to guarantee that each person is as free as I. The engagements that bind us to the social body are obligatory only because they are mutual, and their nature is such that fulfilling them, you cannot work for another without working also for yourself. I believe the contrast between laws made by the general will or those made by a government can be best understood by looking to our current state. For as it stands, we are often beholden to laws which hold little merit, serve the ruling class, not the citizen, or worse yet, are harmful to some people. In fact, we can look to the sheer amount of criminal activity within the states that we reside, despite the wealth of laws that govern us, is not a failing of the individual, but a failing of the state. For if all have what they need, and envy was replaced with empathy in that of our natural form, then such rampant crime and unrest would be rather uncommon. Thus, the need for the amount of laws would lessen. In this way, a well-governed state would be one with few laws and little crime. If either become numerous, then we can be sure that such a state is rotting at its core. I've mentioned many times that the general will of the sovereign dictates the laws that govern it, but this isn't the whole picture. For the function of the state, there would still have to be those who govern and those who obey. In this way, Rousseau saw the state in three parts: the citizens of the state, who dictate the general will, which he called the sovereign, or legislators, though legislators in this sense mean those who decide upon the laws, not those who codify it. Then there is the government, who enforces and maintains the laws in accordance with the general will, also called the executors. And finally, there is the state, which is both the sovereign and the government combined. Both the sovereign and the government are single entities, but both must maintain their part of the bargain, lest the state itself will fail. The important distinction Rousseau makes clear in the social contract was that the executors of the law cannot be the people who decide upon the laws. This is very important, and that the legislators cannot be the ones to enforce the laws. This separation would maintain a balance, for if the government were allowed to decide on the general will, it would then create laws which were in its best interest, not that of the people. And if the sovereign did not abide by the laws that the government enforces, then anarchy would ensue. In this way, the government is merely the force, and the people the right. If either were to break from their role, then the state would suffer. In Book 2 of the Social Contract, Rousseau lays out this balance as such: the government receives from the sovereign the orders that it gives to the people, and for the state to be well balanced, there must, all things being equal, be parity between the product or power of the government taken in itself and the product or power of the citizens, who are sovereign in one hand and subjects in the other. To the point of government, Rousseau goes on to say that there is not one single style of government that is right for enacting the general will of the people, but he does lay out advantages and disadvantages of each. These governments can take any form, from that of a democratic government, an aristocracy, or even a monarchy. We won't go too much into this point, but when deciding upon a government to enact the will of the sovereign, it is important that it takes into consideration the state's size, climate, traditions, resources, and many other factors. The act of creating the government which will enact the will of the people within the state is a very important step, and one of the ones that has the greatest potential for failing, in that the government would naturally wish to prolong its existence by creating laws that benefit it. But Rousseau makes it clear that there has to be safeguards put in place, and that the general will is above all else the grantors of the government, not the other way around. You see, while the government is set up to be the executors of the law, they are not above them, or the people. If the sovereign ever decides a law or a government does not serve the general will, then it will be abolished and replaced. This means it's of the utmost importance that the general will is always checked in on through assembly, and that no one law or government lays stagnant if it fails to serve the state and the sovereign. This means assemblies and voting are still very important, no matter the government style, even while utilizing something like a monarchy. For this, he says, "The act of instituting government is no contract, but a law, that those in whom the executive power is vested are not the people's masters, but its officers, and that the people can appoint them and dismiss them as it pleases." From this point on in the book, Rousseau will lay out the mechanics of the state in greater detail, but for the sake of this video, we will be satisfied with the abstract concepts which hold the social contract together. Now, I hope you've been paying close attention along the way, because this is the point where we will take what we've learned and decide upon the colors which define this philosophy. If it suits you, consider pausing the video and leaving a comment with what colors you would assign to Rousseau's political philosophy, and see if it matches up with my own decision. From my readings of the social contract, I've come to understand that he likes to talk about this idea of creating the closest thing to true freedom based on the general will of the constituents of the state. And for me, that is a perfect reflection of a true white-red society. It's one that has come to terms with the fact that we cannot be truly free as we were in our natural state, but through a negotiation with one another, we can come to terms which are closest to true freedom, one where we are masters of no one but ourselves, all because we have set the terms of our own contract. In Rousseau's vision of a new form of state, we would be the ones to decide upon the laws that govern us, and in that way, by following the will which we dictate, liberty is obtained. Honestly, I don't think we've seen what a true white-red society would come to form in Magic the Gathering without taking a militaristic skew, and the concepts laid out here by Rousseau is one such potential state. But I do think there's one other color which hides within this pair, and that is green, and there's two reasons for this. For one, Rousseau often takes care not to directly define the form of government that this political philosophy will take, because, as he believes, each state must be a reflection of the place and its people, its resources and its intentions. It's a holistic view that works to balance what is required and not force what is desired. Secondly, in defense of green, is that a lot of Rousseau's beliefs go back to his core concept of the noble savage. As a philosopher, he holds an idealized image of what humanity was before it succumbed to civilization, and while in his mind we may never be able to return, he felt that the noble savage was indeed our purest form. So with what I've laid out for you now, I have decided that the political philosophy of Rousseau is that of white, red, green, or Naya. It is a philosophy of freedom through cooperation, and one based in bringing ourselves as close as can be to a state which reflects the natural needs of humanity, that of amour de soi and pitié. Thanks for going on this extensive journey with me. If you want more content like this, then check out my video here on the philosophy of Lovean Satanism. It's easily one of my favorite videos of mine. Also, I want to extend a special thank you to my newest patron, GhostPepper62. If you want to support my work, then consider becoming a patron today. With that, friends, I will catch you in the multiverse. Bye.